Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We're so excited to welcome Reb Zvi Goldstein to the podcast. We're gonna dive into some very interesting topics, something that comes up a lot, Mashiach, Olam Haba, Techiyat HaMetim, and this is something that we've spoken about this off camera, but this is something that people conflate a lot, especially when it comes to someone who's going through a tragedy and is saying how I want to be reunited with my loved one when Mashiach comes. These kind of things happen all the time. I wanted to really get someone who is interested in this topic on, and I feel like you are very qualified. So before we get started, just if you can tell our audience a little bit about yourself, how you found us, and so on.
So I grew up in Maryland. I had my childhood there, and I went to YU for a year. I was in Gush for 2 years, and finished college in Skokie in Skokie Yeshiva. They have have had a comp sci major, and then after I went to Mitzvah and and one of the interesting is that Mitzvah and Gush are sort of I wouldn't say opposites, but some of the people there, when they heard that I studied in Gush, they were like surprised because Mitzvah is very into Kabbalah and it's very hardal, and Gush it's very rational, and even at that time I didn't really see much of a conflict there, and that was. I don't know. That was sort of, I think, maybe a little reflective of my outlook, and then that's sort of most of my yeshiva background. I spent a lot of time, or rather, I've been involved in learning the more nevuchim and Kabbalistic topics for a long time. I first got interested in them when I was a teenager. And I think that's really sort of colored, the way, my thinking has developed over the years. And that's pretty much it.
So I wanted to just briefly plug your book. You have a book on it's a summary to the guide for the perplexed. It's very inexpensive. It's available on Amazon. And it is under the pen name XVI Kaizen, right?
Kaizen. XVI Kaizen. Yeah, that's sort of, I guess it's become sort of a spirit name of mine, I guess. I love the concept of Kaizen. It's a Japanese term meaning the path of continual improvement. And I like that a lot. And then XVI I think is just kind of an interesting way to sell Zvi. But basically what the summary, the guide is, the summary is designed to make the guide for the perplexed accessible. And so to really understand the value of the book, I think, most listeners might be interested in understanding the value of the guide for perplexed itself, right? And so there's this question of why the more nevuchim? Why should a person go out and bother, learning more nevuchim, which I recommend. I think it's great. Especially because it's so dense, it's old. It's always in a translation unless you're familiar with Arabic, Judeo-Arabic. And for me, I think that there's a lot of unique things about Nor Nevuchim. There's three things that I think sort of stand out that I think listeners should know about. Number one is that it's old. It's written 850 years ago. So when it talks about science, when it talks about philosophy, if it's mentioning things that jibe with evolution or modern concepts, this is not really as defensive as a modern book would be, which is a modern book would be like reacting, everybody believes X, Y, and Z, and now we have to sort of reinterpret the Torah so it fits with it. And I feel like because the Rambam is coming from so long ago, it's much more is an authentic reading. It's coming from an authentic place where the Rambam is saying, you know what, a lot of people interpret it differently, and they're totally fine with that interpretation. And he's saying, no, this is like the real deal. And so there's that lack of sort of an apologetic nature to a lot of what it's writing that is, I think, really special. The other thing is that it's written by the Rambam, and the Rambam, he wrote the Yud Gimel Ikarim. He's not the only guy to describe Ikari Emunah, but he wrote them, and so there is, he can say something that might rub people the wrong way, or people might think is a little iffy, in terms of Emunah or Hashkafa. But because it's the Rambam, you can rely on it, that this is an authentic path in Yiddishkeit. Or at least I would suggest that you can rely on the Rambam. And so, I think that the combination of the age and the sort of like reliability and the weight of the author is something really special. Like, Rav Yosef Karo didn't write a book on Hashkafa, but imagine if he had, and it'd be like the Shulchan Aruch of Hashkafa. Well, that'd be pretty interesting. A lot of Hashkafa books, they're not necessarily written by, the halachic authority of the era. And the Moreh Nevuchim is that. And that's pretty unique. The other thing is that I think it really it gives a very, very modern perspective, much more, I would say, modern than a lot of modern books. So I made a little list, but basically, so number one, it has a pretty modern approach, I think, to understanding consciousness and the neshama and how the mind works. It has a modern approach toward being completely, aligned with, being driven by the intellect, having faith in the intellect and data in terms of that, these are going to be the drivers of your, decision making. There's an embrace of non-literal interpretation of the Torah, where a lot, the whole first part of the Moreh Nevuchim is talking about that. Basically, we don't interpret every word of the Torah, literally. We don't do that, and we never did that. You open up the Gemara, it's all non-literal, but people don't really pay attention. There's his moral standard is essentially utilitarian, which didn't really become current. In the Age of Enlightenment, you had a lot of people thinking that way. But even, a lot of modern thinkers sort of like struggle with, where does morality come from? And the Rambam's approach is I think very appropriate for, a modern sort of data-driven thinker. If you want your moral standards to be driven, by the mind and by information. So the Rambam sort of sets it up so you can do that. The way he talks about it, God and Hashem is appropriate. And even miracles, nevuah, like he presents a very, very different perspective, that I think is, can resonate with a lot of scientific thinkers. And so basically for those three reasons, I think it's a great book for somebody that actually wants to, delve into a world of Yiddishkeit that's sort of driven, by the mind and by the intellect. So that's the pitch for that. And you should know, and basically there's a new edition of the Rambam. I don't make any money this. I helped fund it, so I actually lost money on it. But basically, it's the first edition of the Rambam, of the Moreh Nevuchim, excuse me, published with the main commentaries in about 150 years.
Yeah, there's an older one, right? The brown ones, but the print.
Yeah, there's the brown one, and the problem with that is it's like smudgy print. Mm-hmm. It's tiny, and so so basically I found these guys and was like, hey, you got to publish just the book. They have this one with a lot of additional stuff, but basically there's going to be an edition. It's going to be in the printing presses soon. That's basically going to include the main commentaries with bold divrei maschil and
Amazing. When is that going to be available? When is that going to be available?
Hopefully in a few months.
Please,
it should be in the printing presses like in the next few weeks, and then I don't know how long these things actually take to get distributed.
Please email me when it comes out, because that's something I'd love to get.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and the idea is that I think learning the Morning Nevuchim with the commentaries, I think can give a person, especially a sort of person with the yeshiva background, sort of comfort and guidance in terms of understanding the Sefer. It's a complicated Sefer. Why would you learn it without any commentaries whatsoever? And most people do that. And just sort of seeing, the Abar Vanel and, thinkers that have, come before us and grappled over these, these ideas and, seeing what they say can, I think is incredibly enlightening. And it'll even include the Narboni, which is, I think it's been hundreds of years since he was printed with the, in the Morning Nevuchim. So that should be really super cool.
Very cool. Very exciting.
You mentioned how the Rambam wrote about Hashkafa from like in the Rishonim time, which is really interesting. I was actually thinking about it. It is kind of interesting that if you realize that in Sepharad, he wasn't. It's almost like off the top of my head, I can't think of a Hashkafa based book that came out of the Franco-German Rishonim. Perhaps I'm wrong, just not coming to my head. I was thinking about it, but you do have in Sepharad the Kuzari. You have Rambam with Moreh Nevuchim. Not only that, but I think that in his commentary in the Mishnah, he even writes, like, whenever I get a chance to insert hashkafa points, I make sure to really like expound on that. Meaning, it was central to him. Like he even he spells it out. You have the Ibn Ezra with the Yisod Moreh, and also you can also put his Torah commentary has a lot of hashkafa in there. The Ralbag, I think he was from France, but he took on the Sephardi model. You have the To'aliot of the Ralbag, and then you have his major volumes on I forgot the names off the top of my head, but you know what I'm talking about. His major work on Jewish philosophy. It's interesting to me that the Sephardi Rishonim put a lot of time into hashkafa matters, into Jewish fundamentals. And we don't see much of that in Bnei Ashkenaz. And it could be I'm wrong, and I'm not saying anything. I'm not trying to be negative with Ashkenaz. It's interesting to me that in Sepharad you have so many thinkers that took time to put in seminal works on these matters.
This is a lot of conjecture. But I think a lot of it may just be the history of the times, that you had this golden age of Islam that, it's like a huge irony that it followed, this sort of like horrific jihad. But, during the golden age of Islam, they found all these Greek texts, they became popular, they flourished. And you had, I would say the greatest period of religious scholarship, in recorded history, like period. Because the idea of just applying philosophy to monotheism, and it was just like a super popular thing, and I think it got everybody thinking. But that was only in that world, that was part of the Muslim world. The people, the Bnei Ashkenaz, were, it could be that they were thinking, but it's not clear that they had the push from society to ask those questions and to answer them. And it could be that, whatever, oppression, trials of oppression and poverty and scholarship they were going through didn't really allow them to, to publish or spend time, on shkafa. Maybe they were so busy with the bare minimum, making sure people know halacha. They have the Bali Tosot and, those sorts of books. that they didn't have time for Ashkava. But I think that the society that we're in sort of like prods us to ask certain questions. I mean, a lot of the questions that I have or that you have, it's going to be because you talk to somebody or you read a book. Maybe it's a non-Jewish book or non-Jewish person. They ask you a question. It's a really good question, and you want an answer. And I think that was happening a lot in the world of Sfarad.
Fascinating. Iron sharpens iron. When iron sharpens iron. Yeah.
No? I mean, I think so. I mean, I think that I'm really optimistic about the future of religion in Yiddishkeit, because I think that over the next 30, 40 years, it's going to, I think, rediscover its sort of philosophical roots, as it were. And I'm hoping that you could take the path of the Mordevuchim, and you could use that to drive significant changes in the Jewish world, especially in Israel, where the practical maintenance of a country is sort of front and center. What does it mean to be a Jewish country? And for the Rambam, the idea of practical maintenance of how you maintain the country is not like orthogonal to religion. It's not orthogonal to faith. It's supposed to go hand in hand. That if you're doing Yiddishkeit right, that's going to mean that Eretz Yisrael is incredibly successful and liberated and wealthy, and that's really his vision of how Mashiach happens, actually. And I think that it may be that the modern context is going to force people to ask questions, and then when they find these answers, we'll be on a very good path.
I share your optimism on the future of religion and Judaism, also because of the fact that, forget about what, Rav Kook says something very interesting about atheism. Like atheism cleanses the dross of petty religion, right? You can't, you have to you have to approach religion in a more sophisticated manner now, because all the skeptics are tearing it apart, right? And now you are forced to go back to those fundamentals. But even now with the internet, you have, for example, like with the anti-Semitism online, you'll see like people just pulling out random out of context Talmudic, clippings, and they'll just go off on that. And then Jews are forced to dig deep and figure out what does this mean? What's the context? And it's forcing us to kind of have a more elevated, sophisticated response to these things. I'm totally on board.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, there's this great book, Emunah Brura, by Rav Fireman. And he brings this idea of Rav Kook's and a lot of others. It's in Hebrew, but if you're interested, you could learn it. He'd be great to have on the podcast too.
I have one more question before we get into specific topics, because you mentioned earlier how your learning of Kabbalah informed a lot of how you also understood the Moreh. So it's interesting to me because taking verses literally is a thing today. You know this, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting to me because Kabbalah, it's the most non-literal work you'll find. I mean, every verse is taken into worlds and why hasn't Kabbalah at least have been able to get rid of this problem of literalism? Why is it that Kabbalah did not achieve that? That we're still stuck in this right now? I would think that, for instance, when people learn the Moreh and they see how Rambam interprets different verses, it should feel sort of somewhat at home, being that people are pretty much accept the Zohar with everything it does with its verses. So I'm trying to understand why you think that hasn't been effective.
I think that one of the problems is that most people that learn the Zohar don't think about it very deeply, and that sounds rough. But in the parish of the Mishnayos, the Rambam sort of delineates, there's three, camps of people. There's basically three ways to learn midrash. Camp number one interprets everything literally, and they don't really think about it. And they think they're doing a huge mitzvah of giving kavod to the Chazal by, leaving everything literally, but actually it's like awful, and the Rambam doesn't like it at all. He's like, you're turning Am Chacham v'Navon into Am Sachal v'Naval, right? And it's like, wow, that's pretty harsh. Then you have camp number two, where these are sort of like the academics, where they also interpret everything literally. They just don't believe it because it's kind of unbelievable if you think about it, right? So then they say, okay, well, Chazal were just kind of like off their rocker, and then you have camp three, which camp three says, whenever you encounter anything that doesn't make sense and literally, it means, okay, this is a mashal. You sit down and you think about it. And I think you have those three camps in like many arenas in Yiddishkeit.
You're applying that also to the Zohar. That makes sense, actually.
Yeah, right. Most people that learn the Zohar, they're just sort of reading it literally, and it's great. That does it for them, I guess, as long as it's healthy, and then you have a camp of academics that are like, look, I don't know, Rav Yaakov Emden, who's just like, I don't know, he also didn't believe in the Mordechai, so whatever. But but I think it's possible to have a third camp where you sort of blend them, and that's sort of where I find myself. There's this place in the Zohar where it basically says the literal stories. This is like clothing to the body. That the real story is is the Ramazim and the sort of sodot contained in it, right? So what are these sodot? So I would say, well, obviously, if we're talking about Yaakov and his sheep, the reason why that story is in the Torah is not because Yaakov got rich, right? We don't need to know how Yaakov got rich, like all that detail. Like, why is this there, right? Just because it happened, that's not why it's there. It's there because clearly there's lessons to learn from that story, and those lessons that we learn from the story, that's the real meat of it. And what I think that the Rambam also sort of is driving toward that in the end of the Mordechai. He says basically every story, in the Torah has a meaning, it has a lesson. And that's why it's there. It's not there, it's not, it's there to teach you lessons. And the Zohar also, drives that. The only question is what the lessons are. There's actually a place in the summary. There's a little index. It's kind of implicitly also, a little commentary on different parts of the Zohar where it sort of compares and sort of points out there's actually a lot of overlap between the system of the Mordechai and the system of the Zohar. One of them is this huge emphasis on, non-literal interpretation. You also have a huge emphasis on Tami mitzvot, where there's this assumption in the Zohar that like every mitzvah has some sort of symbolism. It means something. It's not just like there is a test and it's sort of arbitrary. The cosmology is almost identical, between the two, where you have, concentric spheres and systems of angels and things like that. The vision of Hashem as being transcendent, it's the same if you're really paying attention. And also the role of the intellect. Like the Zohar is always talking about how, we follow Chachma, Bina, Dat. Like these are the this is where your morality and your all your spirituality is going to come from. It comes from a Chachma, right? That's wisdom. That's the intellect, right? And that's what the Rambam says as well. So so I think you do have that reading there.
Right. And I think that, like you said, if people are learning it as Midrash, the Zohar, there's a lot to gain. The problem is, and I think maybe I could answer Bentzi's question a little bit, is that a lot of the, what we don't really learn the Zohar anymore. We learn all the commentaries on the Zohar and all, everyone that came after that superimposed their own ideas on the Zohar and kind of use that as a springboard to develop the ideas. Like even the Sfirot are not the same, right? So these all developed into something else. So now we're left with this new revelation of what the Sfira is, and therefore the Zohar is not really used the same way as it was originally. So I think that might answer some of the questions.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, I think things changed a lot. After the Arizal, it became, I would say, really disentangled from an understandable cosmology, and really anything understandable. A lot of what the Arizal did is he sort of organized things that the Zohar says, but as if everything in the Zohar is like literally true. So he'll talk about, oh yeah, you have the spirit, you have circles. Sometimes they're described as circles. Sometimes they're described as, the form of a human. And he doesn't, I mean, to my knowledge, like almost nowhere does the Arizal ever come out and say, okay, this is what a sphere is. This is what it means in like real world terms. This is what or. When we say or, this is the concept that we're referring to, right? And as a result, since the Arizal, it's like everybody's interpreting it literally using the Arizal system. And a lot of times you just have, it's just different than when you open up the original Zohar. And, it could be because it's difficult. It could be because it's a lot of poetry. There's something, even after the Arizal, there was a lot of scholarship that quoted the Zohar. Like if you look at Tanya, he's quoting the Zohar all the time. Nefesh HaChaim is quoting the Zohar all the time.
Yep.
I don't know, the Gra is always quoting the Zohar. It's like people were learning the Zohar and somehow this like stopped. Like, you don't really have, people writing books and their quotings are all over the place, like the Nefesh HaChaim does, where it's just like everywhere. Nefesh HaChaim's system, I would say is, also a little problematic in that he has a very literal interpretation.
Yeah.
Of what's going on. But I like the idea that, that thinking deeply about the Torah did not originate, with the Rambam. The Rambam would say this. He'd say, "Oh, my Merkava, my Bereshit." These were things that were sort of carried on in the tradition. They're sort of in the background. So you see sort of hints of it popping up in the Gemara that the Rambam is always, sort of quoting. But your typical Jew may not have been aware of these things. And I like the idea that that you have the Mordevuchim, that's one source of it. But then you can also look at Midrash and the Zohar, and if you look at it carefully, you could say, okay, well, we actually have a tradition of what different things, represent, what they mean, like tefillin. What does it mean? What does it represent? Rambam doesn't talk about. Do we have any tradition about what it symbolizes? And so, I don't know, when I look in the Zohar, I sort of feel like, okay, it just sort of seems to be coming from a very different place than sort of like a modern scholar. And I like that. And look at that, we're talking about the Zohar.
We definitely champion that same approach because people assume like, oh, how many times people ask us, oh, demystified, you're anti-mysticism. We promote mysticism. We just, we are actually kind of looking at it from the approach that you have. So, thank you for saying all that.
And we wanted to get your thoughts on the topic of Mashiach and the Rambam. There's a few bullet points that we'd like to discuss. The era of Mashiach is the natural consequence of keeping mitzvot. What prophecies must he fulfill for us to believe in him? What did the Rambam spell out regarding these things? If we can get a discussion about Mashiach, that'd be great.
Okay, so the Rambam talks a lot about this, pretty explicitly. If any of the listeners are interested, if you look at the last two chapters of Hilchot Malachim, like the very end of the Mishnah Torah, that's where he sort of spells out a lot of it. And then, another place to look is the ninth parak of Hilchot Tshuva, where he gives some more detail. And then, there's obviously, there's the Igerat Teman, where he talks, about Yemot HaMashiach, and then also in the, in his introduction to Parak HaChalek. Anybody can look these up in Safari and sort of get a look. So there's a few things that I think that that even if somebody reads this, they might miss. So one of these things is what you mentioned, this idea of nature, and so the Rambam, he quotes. The Gemara was saying that basically that there's no difference between this world and Yemot HaMashiach except for Shibud Malchut Bilvad, right? Except for basically political subordination. And he says, oh yeah, and the nature is not going to change, right? And he says this because there's basically a lot of midrashim, which if you interpret them literally, imply that, yeah, nature is going to change. People aren't going to die anymore. Everybody's going to be a king. In Parashah Mishnayos, he sort of gives some detail about this. And the Rambam is adamant that no, nature will not change. And the interesting thing is that this is important. The Rambam believes not only is nature not going to change in the future, but also that nature never has changed in the past. And so, in the Mor Nevuchim, this is, like even with Adam and Chava, he's like, how could it be? It can't possibly be that once Shabbos comes in, you could have the nature of a Nachash change fundamentally. That's impossible. And other things with like the longevity of the people in the time of Noah, he answers, he's like, no, it can't be that nature changed at all, even with the Mabul. And so this is like a theme that is not unique to Yemot Mashiach. It's like throughout the Rambam system, nature won't change. And I think that's because we relate to Hashem through nature. Mitzvot operate through natural law. And what the Rambam seems to say, multiple times in, different places, is that the way the mitzvot are set up is that you keep mitzvot, and then there is sort of a first order effect and a second order effect. The first order effect is that if we all keep mitzvot, then the society we live in will become liberated and prosperous. And that is going to occur through a natural process. Like even he interprets mitzvah gorot mitzvah, avera gorot avera, that these concepts are just referring to this idea. It's not like a miraculous spiritual thing. And so the idea is not only in the Yemot Mashiach is nature going to change, but the way we get to Mashiach is by keeping mitzvot and mitzvot operating through natural law. And what I love about this is that what the Rambam is really presenting here is the idea of faith in nature. There's faith in miracles, and then there's faith in nature. And the Rambam is saying, no. If you really understand how nature works, how the world works, then you're going to understand how the mitzvot operate and how they function and how they actually enrich the world and how they actually liberate us, and they're not a burden. And when you do that, then you could understand, first of all, how Mashiach, would come if you're bringing mitzvot. But maybe we can also understand how we can bring Mashiach. Like imagine that, we're going to bring Mashiach and there's no miracles involved and it's going to be through mitzvot. So how is that going to happen? So, if the three of us sat together and talked about, okay, how is this going to happen? It's going to be a very different conversation than if we're assuming this is a miraculous process. And I think that is how the Rambam looks at it, and it's one of these things that you have to look carefully because it's sort of by omission. The Rambam doesn't say that, no, we don't need miracles to bring Mashiach. It's just that in all of his descriptions of how mitzvot operate and how they bring an era of peace and prosperity, he doesn't mention violations of the natural order.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly inside, but I believe it was, I don't remember if it was Igeret Hashmad or Igeret Teman, probably Igeret Teman. Did he not, in Igeret Teman, which I think was written earlier than the Mishnah Torah, did he not express certain miraculous things that will happen when Mashiach comes? I'm wondering if you know what I'm talking about. I saw this a while ago. I don't remember it offhand though.
I'd have to
look at it
into it.
It was earlier. He wrote it earlier, so it seems like as if his mind changed over time on the topic. I just thought that was interesting. But
maybe the thing is that one of the things that the Rambam says in the Parashah Mishnayot is like, he's sort of explaining. He's like, well, so the Rambam basically suggests that a lot of what Chazal say about Olam Haba is a metaphor, right? In Mashiach, right? And then he says, well, so if that's the case, why did Chazal say it with a metaphor? Why didn't they just put it out there literally, right? And his answer is basically, well, a lot of people, they're not really going to get the abstract literal stuff, but they are going to get these metaphors. And so that's what we're going to give them. And interestingly, there's even a place in the Zohar where it says that, where this idea, they're going to have a feast, they're going to eat the Leviathan or whatever in the future, the one of Mashiach, and they have these grapes. This is a metaphor for Torah. And so, I don't remember the Igeret Tema. We could look it up now if we wanted to. It would be a little bit of distraction, but his audience for Igeret Tema is basically people that are just crushed, right, with spiritually, they're just like on the cusp of just mass like going off the derech, right? Yeah. And so I think that the purpose of this book is like, okay, he wants to give people hope, he wants to keep them on the derech, and he's speaking to a wide audience. So there's interesting things he said there. He says, like, oh yeah, we never calculate when Mashiach is going to come. We don't like that. Chazal don't like that. We don't do that. But here's my calculation, right? And it's like, well, which one is it? And so I sort of wonder if he writes one, to the leadership. Like the leadership should know that we don't calculate the end of days. You don't publish it. Like, even if you personally think Mashiach's coming tomorrow, like, don't tell your community that. Just tell everybody Mashiach is coming. Don't worry, for sure Mashiach is coming. Better times are coming. Just don't like harp on exactly when, because this is a recipe for people, losing hope or giving up hope. If it's too far in the distance, they're going to give up hope. If it's too close and then time passes, they're going to give up hope. So just don't do that. But then for the people that are so crushed that they sort of feel like, I can't wait another 100 years of this misery, forget it, so he's like, okay, for those people, okay, here's an interesting calculation. And so he puts up this calculation that's in the not too distant future from, when it was like, 100 years or 75 years or something after the Rambam was writing it.
Yeah.
And, I wouldn't be surprised if he uses, expressions like that.
So moving on this topic, I actually want to just touch on the idea of naturalism and how it would happen today. Today, we don't really have monarchies anymore. It's kind of like, even if they exist, they're few and far between or symbolic at best. And we live in, in a world of politicians and so forth. So how would that play out, in the world today?
Okay, so I'd say this is kind of there's what the Rambam says, and then like there's ideas that the three of us can throw around. The Rambam is pretty adamant. The way he describes things is with a king, with a melech. The mitzvot don't change. That's pretty clear in the Rambam. That the mitzvot don't change, and even in the Mashiach. And so if we have a mitzvah of making a king, so that means making a king, right? And then and that's sort of where the Rambam leaves it. The three of us are sort of, at least me personally, like, I'm a little disturbed by this because, historically, monarchies, they often turn into dictatorships. They can be abusive. They don't tend to be as stable as democracies, which is why most of the world today is kind of democracy. At least the country's doing well. And so, the idea of a melech, it just sort of seems like
the biblical model, kind of, you can call it a failure, I guess, because it didn't really work out for the most part.
Yeah, I think it is a failure. You look at Sefer Melachim, it was written by Yirmiyahu. Like, I think that Sefer Melachim in many ways is sort of like a problem statement where, it's a sort of a tragic book, starts with Shlomo, starts on a high note, and it's sort of like one of the lessons is that I think if you start a dynasty, even if you're starting with David HaMelech and Shlomo, like, you're starting at a really good place, after 15 generations, it's going to be, it seems like it's not a good situation. Having a great king is not going to save everybody.
Well,
So,
Shmuel Hanavi from the start basically says this is not what God really wants.
right,
But if you insist on being like the Goyim, then fine.
right. So yeah, so this is like, and it's one of these problems that, when you crack open, in the world of Tanakh, people are just kind of like puzzled. They're like, are we supposed to have a king or we're not supposed to have a king? Shmuel seems like not, but then the Torah says yes. Well, what is this? Shmuel disagree. Anyway, so I I think that there's ways to interpret the mitzvah of a melech that sort of open it up to a much more practical guide. So number one, it says som tasim alech hamelech, right? So who's making the king? It's you. It's the Sanhedrin, and that implies that the ideally the king has the support of of the people behind him, right? And this is I would say different from from a vision where Mashiach, he's like a prophet and he just sort of like tells everybody what to do and everybody listens. That's not the sort of vision in the Torah. And something to think about is that I believe the Roman Caesars were halachically considered kings, and that's even though they were elected by the Senate. So that implies that if you have a that a democratically elected king is still a king. So you could have a situation, I believe, where you have a king and he's democratically elected, and you fulfill the mitzvah of some tasim alech hamelech. Okay, the Navi, okay, I have to deal with that. But just the fact that there's a system in place to ensure that whatever the king is doing is aligned with what people want, that may not disqualify him from being king, and that may even be an implication of what the Torah is talking about. You also have, interestingly, you have the mitzvot of not having too many wives, too much money, right? Right? So the Torah, if you think about it, what the Torah is doing is saying, hey, you know what? The king is, we need a king, but he's an executive. And the Sanhedrin is going to be on top of him, and they're actually going to enforce laws that limit his powers, and they're going to limit him in a way that ensures that his incentives are aligned with the incentives of the nation. Like that's the point of those mitzvot. And so, it could be, if you dig into those deeply, like, I think that the vision of the Torah is not that you have a dictator. It's clearly the Sanhedrin. You have a Melech David. He goes to court. Right? It's in the Mishnah, like Daninoto. So the king is not above the law. The king is under the law in the Jewish vision. And I think that I would say, in terms of like, bringing Yemot Mashiach, it could be that, if the Medina d'Israel really thought about, abstractly, what is an optimal system for, for government in terms of controlling the executive branch, and what we see in the Torah, you could end up with a system that is like driven by Torah knowledge that actually leads to a really fantastic, governing system.
I mean, you could say America is kind of like a improved version on ancient Israel in a way, in kind of how the founding fathers saw that, we have to have this balance of power and the three branches of government and so on and so forth. It's kind of a way to ensure that, there's as little corruption as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that they were also, I think they were also, to a certain extent, aware, of what they were doing. You would be surprised. They quote, who is it? Jeremy Bentham? One of these guys, one of these writers around, around the time of the founding of the U.S. is like, he quotes Sefer Shmuel in terms of, understanding, the morality of a king, and going into that. So they were basically looking in Tanakh and thinking, okay, well, how do you actually practically implement, this moral system, and in what way is it moral, and how do you learn it, based on Tanakh? It's pretty interesting, and I think that, if I would love to think that, if the Yidden say, okay, let's take this and run with it, that we could come up with a much better system.
So that answers the question that people have submitted, into the, to our emails, but asking what comes first, Mashiach or the Sanhedrin. So, I'm glad we finally had this addressed. And just wanted to understand, like, just for the audience to know, what are some of the proofs of, how do we know this is the Mashiach? What's supposed to happen?
Signs. Yeah. The signs.
Yeah. So, well, the Rambam lists them, in the Mishnah Torah. He has to bring all of Israel. Let's see if I remember the list. He has to basically bring, Am Yisrael to do tshuva. He has to build the Beit HaMikdash. He has to fight wars. He has to. There's a few other situations.
Yeah,
I
he has
believe
to, in gathering the exiles is one of them, and also, he has to have children who will take over for him, or people who take over for him. Obviously, it's a natural world in Rambam's.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing, he has to die.
Right.
The Rambam says that he will die, and his son will take over. So if he doesn't, then that retroactively that meant that he wasn't Mashiach. And ironically, yeah, I think those are some of the signs. I guess these days people think the Lubavitch Rebbe, like, was he the Mashiach? And I think you'd have to do some crazy
mental gymnastics
to fit the Rambam in there. Like he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael, he didn't fight any wars, he put out shluchim, but that's not being machzir everybody to do tshuva. It's just not the same. There's no Beit HaMikdash, so yeah. So I think, but the interesting thing is, I would say it's one of those things that the Rambam says that when we're there, it'll be clear. Like he says in the Hilchot Malachim, he's like, well, we have all these nevuot, and some of them are literal, and some of them are not, and and he's like, well, you have all these details, but these aren't like the ikar of the dot. Like this is not essential to the religion because they don't add to the year and ava of Bnei Israel, and so just don't think too much about them, But when the time comes, you're going to know.
I think that's such an important feature of Judaism. Just like, it's really not highlighted. It's not something we obsess over. Moshe famously says, choose life, right? We're focused on this world. And the Hamisha Chumshei Torah obviously don't even maybe allude to these things, but it's not explicit. So it's just other religions are more focused on Olam Haba or Mashiach or whatever it is. We're more focused on the here and now. I think that's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. And I think it's like, right? Like the Rambam enters the stage, right? Because there's different ways of doing Yiddishkeit, and some of them are very much focused on Olam Haba, at the expense, even of Olam Hazeh. And the Rambam, he wants to say, I think he wants to say, no, they're consonant. Like there's no, like if you believe that there's a trade-off between Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba, in the broad sense, not like in our, in the narrow sense, then that's a misinterpretation. Maybe you could even learn that from the story of the Akedah. But yeah, the Torah doesn't talk about it. I mean, there are opinions that, in the archaeology, that basically the Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife. And so, the Torah, Dafka wanted to underemphasize the afterlife to tell you that, basically the Torah is about Olam Hazeh. And, if you look in the Rambam's Ta'amei Mitzvot, it's all about Olam Hazeh. It's all about either, economically, setting the right incentives so that people behave better in Olam Hazeh, or learning midot related to that, or, accepting certain truths. But like the front and center is Olam Haba.
So now we can transition into the next segment, which is going to be about the Rambam's take on Olam Haba. So if you can just give us a nice summary of that.
Yeah. So there's two things I think to pay attention with the Rambam's Olam Haba. So number one is the Rambam spends a lot of time telling us what Olam Haba is not, which it's not a big party in the clouds. And he goes out of his way to do this because number one, a lot of other religions, particularly Islam, they believe that, yeah, that's what it is. It's a big party in the sky or an endless war. I don't know, whatever it is. Imagine something fun. That's what it is, right? And these visualizations are helpful because a lot of people, I don't know, they need some motivation. And so this is what you'll have in a midrash or something. And the Rambam basically says, no, none of that. There's no physical pleasures. You're not even going to want it because physical pleasures, they're all relative to the body that we live in, right? And even our emotions and our sensations are optimized for our survival, right? The reason why good, healthy food typically tastes good, that is better than like paint, let's say, is because it's good for you, right? And in general, good, like a temperature that feels good is typically the temperature at which your body will function. And the things that make you happy are typically things that are good for you. It's a reward telling you, oh yeah, do this more. Things that are painful is typically, it's your body telling you, don't do that again. And as a result, it's like impossible for us to imagine some sort of pleasure or benefit that has like nothing to do with this like paradigm that we live in. And, and the Rambam basically, he says this in the Parashat Mishnayos, that like we can't imagine it. And that's what Olam Haba is, because you don't have a body, right? The body doesn't make it up there. It's not like a ghost. And I think that this idea that that it's not what you think is important, because I think what the Rambam, he doesn't say this explicitly. I think what he's implying is that Yiddishkeit is more than just the pursuit of pleasures. Because if in Olam Haba, right, it's all about pleasures, then really what Yiddishkeit is all about pleasures. You just think you're being more strategic than the guy going to the nightclub. But really it's like your goal is the same. If you just think that there's more later on, right? So I think the Rambam wants to get us out of that thinking and saying, no, it's not about pleasures. It's not about having fun. There's something greater and grander that Yiddishkeit is all about. And it's something abstract. So, the Rambam does give some detail on what it is. It's a little bit of a tease, but it seems like what happens is the pure information in our minds is what lives on forever, right? Which is interesting because basically there's the part of our mind that's dependent on the body, which I think is significant because it seems like the Rambam does believe that the intellect and consciousness, this is based on the material matter of our body. It's not something supernatural. And he applies this in the Mordevuchim, and he sort of says it in the Mishnah Torah. And so, what does that leave us with? And it's basically the tzurot, like these forms that we learn about over our life. That's sort of what survives. And what are the tzurot? These are ideas. These are like the sichlim nifrim, the separate intelligences. These are sort of abstract concepts that drive the world. That when we know them, we sort of attach ourselves to the information that's driving the world. And all this is sort of
it's kind of like cloud-based information, right? Like it's not the body, right? It's something beyond, but it's not God.
Right. It's not, yeah, it's like it's not the body, it's not Hashem, it's the thing that connects us to Hashem, right? And I think that there's a lot of metaphors going around here, because even this idea of this sichlim nifrim, these like separate intelligences that the Rambam talks about, and everybody's like, oh, that's so Aristotelian. I think that where this comes from is that people understood in the ancient world that they learned from the body, and the body, you have a mind that's not observable, that drives your behavior, And that is what gives the behavior of your body order and purposefulness, is your mind. So nobody sees it, but we intuit that it's there. And then people look at the world and say, okay, well, the world behaves in a very orderly way. It behaves in a purposeful way in the sense that all the animals are sort of configured how they need to be. Nature operates how it needs to be for the sustenance of life. And therefore, there must be some analog in the universe that performs the same function that our mind functions. And that's sort of what drives the order. This would be like if you could take the laws of gravity and laws of physics and put them in a box. That's what these are. And I think the idea is that when we learn information about these ideas that are driving the world, then there's a connection there. And then the idea is that because information is transcendent of time and space, it's true everywhere. So Olam Haba isn't necessarily like in space. It's like right here. It's all around us. In the same way that the law of gravity is all around us. The gravitational constant is all around us. It's everywhere. And so I think that what the Rambam's saying is that when we sort of know about these truths, we attach ourselves to these truths, and then we will live eternally. And I think that obviously it's like, okay, this is a very nice visualization, but it's very difficult to understand really completely in a way that resonates emotionally. It's like so abstract. And I think that that's why the Rambam is giving, two flavors. He sort of says, okay, well, on one hand, like this is sort of what it's about. On the other hand, he's like, yeah, but we don't know what that means. You just trust him that it's something wonderful. I mean, for me, I think that, well, the Rambam doesn't really say this, but I think that the idea that, imagine that you live on, through the ideas that you grasp in your mind, but also through the ideas that you teach others. Right? If you teach somebody an idea, right, the Gemara says it's, and then they repeat it. It's like your lips are moving in the grave. Like, what does that mean? Your lips are moving in the grave. It's not literal. What does that mean? And I think the idea is that, people live on through their influence on other people. And so if you can imagine, well, if Olam Haba is the world of information, and the world of information, as a metaphor is the 10th sphere, but everybody knows really is transcendent of time and space. So in a way, I think that may be what the Rambam is talking about in terms of, becoming the information that sort of spreads throughout the world. Like after a person is gone, Rav Avadia may have passed away, but the ideas that he sort of gave to other people, live on. And in many ways, like you could say that is Rav Avadia's chelik on Olam Haba, is this information that is sort of spread around the globe. But no, the Rambam does not say that explicitly. That's conjecture. That's a lot of conjecture.
It's a very, very tough subject. Olam Haba is so hard. It's such a hard subject to try to understand it. And I think the point that you're also trying to make is that to some extent it's not understandable. And so we have to try to do the best we could to try to.
I mean, another way of looking at it is that, let's define Olam Haba as the ultimate goal of Yiddishkeit, the ultimate purpose and meaning of our lives, of not just our lives, but like everybody's lives, right? So what is that? And the answer is famously like not answerable, because any sort of thing that you could chew on this to say like, oh, this is the meaning of the world, X. Then you can always ask, well, why is X so important? Like, what is the point of X, right? And then you can just sort of ask why forever. And you see what I mean? Am I not being good?
Yeah.
So this is the famous thing in like the Hitchhiker's Guide, to the Galaxy, where people ask this big computer, what's the meaning of the world and everything, and it comes out, it just says, oh yeah, it's 42, but but basically you're not asking the right question anyway. And so so I think that there's something true here that basically, I think the fact that Olam Haba is not graspable is a reflection of this idea that we don't clearly understand the point of Yiddishkeit, of like where it's going. I think that we all have faith that it does have a point, that it is going toward something wonderful and beautiful. But what that thing is something, I think, that it's sort of beyond, what we would imagine.
It's like trying to understand God. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Because if we understood our ultimate purpose, then we would understand God. But I think what is comforting for some people, like this is why people are drawn to Kabbalah, is there seems to be a cookie cutter kind of, answer and explanation for everything that happens. That comes with its drawbacks as well. Obviously, on the flip side, when you explain that, for example, like reincarnation and then all the rungs that the soul goes through after death, and things can still change after death. That is something that might comfort people, but other people might find that a little bit disturbing. And then there's the idea of the Rambam, which is there's finality to the soul, right? What you do here and that's it. There's no change after. And in a way, that gives people, in my opinion, a sense of urgency. If more people believed and accepted that reality, there would be more of a sense of urgency to do as much as we can in this world, rather than maybe putting it off or okay, I'll have another chance in my next life, as the Kabbalists, believe. But also this abstractness of the soul, whereas in the Kabbalistic literature, it's very defined, and then it's kind of, I don't know, maybe it comes off as a little bit of a letdown because it is defined, it is explained, or some people will even explain it's a piece of God or whatever it is. And that to me is very, it's a kind of a letdown. I don't know if you agree with me on that.
Well, let me think about it. I mean, I think that you could, like, there's a few reasons why I think Kabbalah would appeal to a lot of people. First of all, I think that there is a sort of system of philosophy that, if a person hasn't encountered anything else, then it does answer, some questions, or at least gives some answers, to questions. The other thing is that, I think that there is something in people where we love magic, people that gamble, they sort of like love this idea of being lucky and special. And I think Kabbalah sort of caters to that. And this is sort of where it gets a little creepy, because I think Avodah Zarah also caters to that. This idea that you could sort of trick the world, that you just do this, and then the spirits are going to be aligned. And you have a lot of similar things in Kabbalah where, maybe it's taking the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah and magic and sort of putting it into a place that is better, ideally, unless they're davening to Sphira, which is awful. I mean, that's just like literally Avodah Zarah. And then, but I think that, getting back to planet Earth, I think something that's very engaging is the use of visualizations. That, Midrashim use visualizations, these sort of like visual stories, to impart a philosophical lesson, right? And that's how the Rambam looks at a lot of Midrashim, in Adam and Chava, and, in 230, right, in part 2, chapter 30, like he talks about masturbation. All these chazals about Adam Arishon being, that are just fantastic. That the Eitz HaChaim was this big, and Adam Arishon was this tall, and all these things. The Rambam is interpreting these as metaphors. And what's so beautiful about them is that when you have these like visualizations and these graphic stories, you can tell a small child these stories, they'll remember it. And then when they're 40, when they're 50, ideally, they'll start thinking about it, and they'll realize that there's a lot of depth in these stories. And I think that, the Kabbalistic system, in the Zohar, they're sort of following that path, where they give these very visually appealing descriptions of lights and, I don't know, animals and things like that. And I think that this sort of like tickles the imagination, whereas the more Nevuchim, it doesn't. It tickles the mind, if anything. But the Rambam doesn't really go on and on about, fantastic stories. He's sort of like laying it out as it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we kind of touched on it earlier, but the issue with, let's say, Kabbalah was the Zohar as a midrash is perfectly, it's beneficial in many ways, but we see even in the midrash, all of these things are supposed to lead to a deeper understanding of things because we explain how, what they really are teaching us. Whereas in Kabbalah, what gets lost a little bit is that it ends up kind of like Benti and I use this term a lot, literal metaphors, where it's kind of like towing the line whenever it
Oh yeah.
yeah, it's kind of whenever it suits the argument, it becomes a metaphor. But whenever it doesn't, it's a literal. So it's kind of like it's a tricky place, and it's definitely for some people it's perfectly fine. For others, like myself, it's a little unsettling. But I don't know what your thoughts
Well,
on.
I think it is. I think it is important for people to realize that, like, ideally, Kabbalah is not all of it. I mean, the interpretation shouldn't be this, but a lot of it is poetry, and so it's poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
So you don't want to interpret these a lot of it literally, like even with the tefillin on Chol Hamoed thing, where the Zohar is like, don't put a tefillin on Chol Hamoed because and then he gives this little metaphor, the story of a king and thing, and if somebody did to that king, he would be chayiv mitzvah, right? And then people are like, oh, you learned from that somebody puts tefillin on Chol Hamoed, they're chayiv mitzvah. It's like that's not even what the Zohar says. The Zohar says in the story that he would be chayiv mitzvah, not that he's actually chayiv mitzvah, right? And I'm like,
That's a
so
great point. That's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
no,
it's like I don't know, like the literalism. I think it can also go to a very dark place. I mean, I think a lot of what the Shabbatai Tzvi did was he just sort of like interpreted the Zohar literally, and that's what happened. And there's a lot of places where it says things that are, if you just interpret it like absolutely literally, would just you could just take it to a place of the Shabbatai Tzvi.
Yeah.
So I think it's like like on one hand, like
I think Lurianic
you were
Kabbalah
saying,
had
oh yeah, it
a
could
lot
work
to.
for everybody, but I'm like, well, I'm not sure, because sometimes it could take them to a place where they don't know what Hashem is, they don't know what mitzvot are, that it could lead to a place of dysfunction, where the nefesh hachaim, we're saying like everything is Torah, and then could lead to a place where a person ignores their family and doesn't have a job, or I don't know,
Yeah.
and it's sort of like an understanding of mitzvot that is totally divorced from Olam Haba, and that is that's not something that we see in Chazal explicitly and implicitly.
Yeah, I mean, and also just to go back to the Shabbatai Tzvi comment, I think it's not just the literalism of the Zohar. Many will argue that it's the interpretations of the Zohar, and it's Natan of Gaza was an expert in Lurianic Kabbalah, and that also kind of shaped his worldview and talking about the dark side and so on and so forth, doing mitzvah sins for the sake of heaven, all these ideas, distortions of Kabbalah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can lead to a very dark place. Unfortunately, there are a lot of, th when things go haywire, it usually is because people dabbling with mysticism and they probably shouldn't. And there's a reason
Yeah.
why our Chachamim have told us, this is not either you stay away from it or you learn it after 40 years old, and so on and so forth. It's not something that we're supposed to just, today it seems like everybody wants to learn it.
Yeah.
They want to start the story from the end instead of getting to the foundations.
Yeah, and I mean, and just even knowing that it's poetry is important. But so I was once learning with the Perikachalik, the Rambam's introduction to Perikachalik, and there's like supposedly three sections. And somebody pointed out, actually, logically, there's a fourth quadrant. Basically, there's two dimensions. There's whether you interpret it literally or not, and then I think there's another dimension of are you applying your rational faculty or not, right? And so the Rambam describes the people that that are interpreting it literally and not using their rational faculty. There's the people that interpret it literally and are applying their rational faculty. There's the people that are not interpreting it literally but they are applying their rational faculty. That's like the third camp of the Rambam is. And then there's theoretically a fourth camp, people that are not interpreting it literally and are also not using their rational faculty. And that's basically the quadrant of the crazies, right? Where basically if you're not going to interpret something literally, it's like, well, what is guiding your interpretation? What is limiting it, right? And so for the Rambam, it's like, well, you use your seichel, you use your wealth of knowledge of Torah and mitzvot and the world and how it operates, and that's going to enable you to interpret something, literally but safely. And that's what he does throughout the whole Mor Nevuchim. Like he does interpret, Hinei Hashem nitzav alav. And he's like, oh, nitzav, that's not literally nitzav, but he has a method. It means something very specific, right? It's a rational derivation, right? But if somebody doesn't go through that, then there's like no limit to how wacky things can get. And I think that that's I would say that's the sort of the problem with like the with some of like the Lurianic Kabbalah, where like nobody has people don't know what's literal, what's metaphor, nothing makes sense. There's also Keter, which doesn't appear very much in the actual like original Zohar, but then later on became very prominent, which is basically this idea that Hashem is above conception, but also our relationship with Hashem is above conception. And therefore, where you can take this is, well, anything goes, right? And that's not where the Rambam takes it. The Rambam says, we use our intellectual faculty to connect with Hashem. This is our connection. We do understand our relationship with Hashem insofar as we relate to Hashem through the universe. And if we understand how the universe operates, then we understand how to, get the various brachot that the world has to offer. And so, that's very different. One is basically pro, intellect, and intellect is basically driving our whole religious experience and religious function. And in the other avenue, you're basically saying, the intellect is sort of like, it's a trick, it's a facade. And, obviously, once you sort of leave the domain of the rational, it's like, well, then there are no boundaries.
Well said. Very well said. Moving to the next segment, we want to talk about Techiyat HaMetim. This is something that, speaking of people who read into things, but there are a lot of times what people do with Rambam, different scholars and rabbis, that they'll kind of, it's Maimonides and your Maimonides, everybody has their version of things. So there are many who will say that the Rambam didn't actually mean what he said, or that he wrote the Igeret HaTchiyah reluctantly, and you hear those arguments all the time, and we want to kind of put that argument to rest. But if you can just kind of explain what his view on Techiyat HaMetim is.
So I'll try to do this in a nuanced way. So the Rambam says like several times that we believe that people will come back, from the dead, literally, and that somebody that does not, ascribe to this, has basically no chelik. They're not part of Am Yisrael, and they're like totally excluded. And he says this in a few places, so that's sort of clear. But the question I would like to open up is, why is this so important, right? It's not mentioned in the Chumash, and it doesn't seem, is this really consequential in terms of our emunah? By Mashiach, he was saying, oh yeah, the details don't matter. I think the things that do matter are sort of the things that are based on the psukim in the Torah that he brings in the previous chapter, but whatever. But I think that this raises a question of like, what does Techiyat HaMetim, mean to, a Jew in 2024? Like, how is it impacting us, in terms of our faith? And I think there's two ways, right? I think there's obviously, a very basic way, which is that, in times of great stress, I think a lot of people are reassured by the promise of seeing their loved ones again. And I think that one of the things that one of the reasons why, saying there's no Techiyat HaMetim is such a severe thing is because I think that for those people, you can just sort of ruin everything. And the same thing that if you went around saying, oh, Mashiach's going to come, but it's going to be in like 10,000 years. Like a lot of people might take that as like, oh, well, I'm just going to like give up then. Like, I don't even know if there's going to be planet Earth in 10,000 years, So I think that, that's why it's such a, it's like a severe, I don't want to say crime, but, sin or whatever, in the Mishnah to say there's no Techiyat HaMetim in a Torah is because, I think it can be, very difficult for people that, have a lot of their, hopes and dreams in their life sort of bundled with it. But then the question is, okay, so what about for other people? And there's something interesting, which is that, if you look at the different ways Techiyat HaMetim is used, there's sort of three things that it sort of is connected with. So one is if you look in Yechezkel, it's connected with the idea of a national resurgence, right? If you look in the the Nevuah of the Atzmot Yeveshot, you have this valley, you have these bones. They're actually in Chutz La'aretz, which is interesting because the Techiyat HaMetim is supposed to be in Eretz Yisrael, but whatever. So you have these bones, and the Ruach comes, and and they basically come back to life. And then there's this whole machlokus: was this a literal thing? Was this a figurative thing? But if you ask, somebody that learns Tanakh, what this means, they will say, oh, well, based on the context here, what's going on here is Yechezkel is giving a prophecy to give people hope that even though they're in Galut, they're in the valley, which is Bavel, they need to have faith that Hashem is going to take them out, that they're going to get out. There's going to be a natural resurgence. And that's sort of the pshat of what that nevuah is about. I don't think it's a coincidence that we read it on Pesach, because Pesach is also about a similar thing. People are in Egypt. They were there for 400 years. A lot of people thought they were never going to get out. And, part of this is just like we came out of Mitzrayim, we're going to come out of the current Galut. And I think that's what, a lot of that vision is about. If you look at how Techiyat HaMetim is used in the Shemona Esrei, based on the context, it means something else, right? So there, it's like Rofeh Cholim, Matir Asurim, right? He's going to heal the sick. The people are going to get out of prison, and Mechai Metim, right? That basically there, the significance is that this is like the ultimate surprise. This is the ultimate shock, and I think the idea there is that we have faith that the world is full of surprises, and we have emunah that like things can be really dark. And you don't know what's going on, under the hood or behind the scenes. Things can be going on, things are in place, and then we have emunah that this is how Hashem, runs the world. Many things are surprising. Yeah, maybe people will come back from that. I don't know. Maybe they will. And I think that faith is, it's almost like a humility. That we have, that we have faith that sort of like anything can happen. We're not going to put limits on it. And I think that there's something else which I think is important. Like if you look at the various proofs that Masechet Sanhedrin brings for Techiyat HaMetim, like they're not really satisfying. Like I don't know if you learn them. Like what it's coming up in Daf Yomi. So. It's one of these things where you learn it, and it's like, oh, like one of the man yirbu yimechem v'imei al damashen yishva Hashem levotechem lahem. So it's lahem to the forefathers, not to us, right? So you say, mikan, Techiyat HaMetim in the Torah. So basically, because it says that he's going to give it to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and clearly they passed away before Hashem gave it to all of Am Yisrael. So therefore, we know that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are going to come back. Now, there's something interesting here, which is that if we didn't have the Gemara, the way we'd interpret this is just say, no. Poetically, if Hashem gives it to their children, it's like he's giving it to them, right? That we say, as long as Yaakov's children are alive, it's like he's alive. because we just had in Daf Yomi, the children take the place of their parents, right? So when Hashem promised Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov that he was going to give them Eretz Yisrael, it wasn't necessarily them personally; it was their children, and that's kind of the same thing, right? And the interesting thing is that you could suggest that the Gemara there is not. I want to say it's proscriptive, not descriptive. That part of the Gemara there is telling you what part of Techiyat HaMetim is about. That part of Techiyat HaMetim is about is this idea that the children live on through the parents. Now the thing is that the Rambam doesn't connect these three ideas, but these are sort of like my conjectures of why Techiyat HaMetim. Like there's that Techiyat HaMetim is important, and then there's this other question of like why is it important? And the reason why I think that that's relevant to the Rambam is because the Rambam believes that all the mitzvot have a time. There's no such thing as a mitzvah that's just like a test of faith. That we're supposed to believe something even though it has like no impact or relevance, or function. And so that would apply to, Ikarei Emunah, that the articles of faith are going to be there because they are, connected with some sort of essential degree of emunah. And we see this in this discussion of Mashiach, where he says, the details of Mashiach, they're not important. Why? Because they don't contribute to Ava and Yira, right? So this implies, right, that if they were important to Ava and Yira, then we should figure out those details, right? And then, that sort of, I would say that implies that the elements of Mashiach that we are required to believe in, it is because they contribute to Ava and Yira. And so I would like to suggest that it's the same thing for Techiyat HaMetim. So this is a sort of like a nuanced approach. I think that there's a lot of discussion over whether the Rambam believed in Techiyat HaMetim or not, in the academics, not in like the Jewish scholar, the from scholarship. But I think that there's multiple paths. There's one path where the Rambam, literally believed it, and just as he literally says, and there's no questions about it. He says it a million times, and there's no questions. Then there's the other approach, which is that no, he says it, but if you look carefully, there's some inconsistencies. It's a little funny, and so he didn't really mean it. And then so what does that mean? How could the Rambam wasn't the like? It doesn't make any sense. And I think that there's a third approach, which is that the Rambam did very much believe in Techiyat HaMetim, but the way he believed in it was not, sort of a simplistic, vision where people just sort of dig out of their graves and they walk along and that's it. And you have to believe that that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, you're not part of Am Yisrael. I think that there's a deeper message here, and I think that sort of resolves the conflicts. But I would say if there's anybody out there, that is very concerned about Techiyat HaMetim, one way or another, they could reach out privately. But there's a mission about talking about these things. I'm not sure, it's really for a public discourse.
Before we go, we want to get into animal sacrifice in the era of Mashiach. And you have some points you want to make, about that Korbanot aren't any different than Orla and milk and meat. So I want to hear your take, and we also have some other questions.
Sure. I would say, like, number one is that I think that we shouldn't worry. I think that the idea is that in the Yemot Mashiach, people are going to be very, very well informed, much better informed than us. And I think that we also have faith that all the mitzvot, if completely understood, are not only good for Am Yisrael, they're also something that is a source of pride that we could tell anybody and they would understand it, right? So there's this pasuk that the Rambam sort of, I'm not sure he mentions it more than once, but it's like super significant. That basically, that basically the Torah is our chokhmah bina in the eyes of the goyim, right? And when they hear about all the mitzvot, they're going to be like super impressed, right? And what we can learn from this is that the mitzvot, they all have a function that's understandable and also communicable, right? So we can, and it's also a good thing, right? So there's not a mitzvah under the sun in the Rambam's view that isn't actually good for us in a way that we could tell. So, and this applies to Korbanot. So the Rambam is very adamant that in Yom Mashiach, we're definitely going to bring Korbanot in the sense that the Torah is never going to change. Torah never changes. I think that in the same way that nature never changes and Torah operates through nature, the Torah never changes, which actually, by the way, creates a problem. If you do believe that there's the laws of nature are going to be different in Yom Mashiach, then really the Torah should change because, people aren't going to have a Yetzer Hara. So maybe you don't have to, why would you be Shomer Negiah? Why would you have to wear a tzitzit if there's no Yetzer Hara? If you don't have a taiva for Avodah Zarah, maybe you could shave your payas. And anyway, so basically, so the Torah is never going to change. And I think that there's sort of like two options. One is sort of a cop out, and then one is, I don't know. You decide which one is the cop out. The listeners can decide. So basically, one approach is no. We're going to bring the Korbanot, just like it says in the Torah, and everything's happy. This is wonderful. And in the Kohen Gadol and everything, it's going to be wonderful. And in addition, because we're going to understand how this mitzvah functions and the role it plays and the lessons we learn from the performance of the mitzvah, it will be something that everybody sees as a good thing. So even the vegans and the animal rights people, like there's not going to be a big protest, about this whole thing because Mashiach, everybody's going to understand why this is a good thing and why it was commanded to Moshe Rabbeinu and how it sort of resonates and is important, right? So that's option number one. I think the possibility of bringing Korbanot and there's like protests is like, I don't think that that's realistic because I think that an essential part of the Mashiach, he's going to bring everybody to tshuva, not through, some sort of like oppressive regime. It's through education that there's going to be this outpouring of knowledge and we're just going to understand. So the other possibility is that I'm not sure how. So this is like a conjecture, but in the same way that Chazal sort of publicized the din of the ability to do a prusbul. You could do that in theory with maybe other mitzvot. I don't know. I'm not on the Sanhedrin, but basically there you have the Shemitah Kesafim in the Torah. It's very clear what happened. Chazal saw, wait, this is being dysfunctional. This is like wrecking the financial markets, which are Chazal understood are essential. And as a result, they said, okay, look, we always had this din. We just never sort of published it. And now we're going to publish it. And, it may be in the time of Sanhedrin, in the time of the Mashiach, the Sanhedrin would do something like that. But either way, I feel like it's not something to lose sleep over. Like if a person, they're really attached to animal rights and they just like cannot wrap their head around animal sacrifice. So they could say, don't worry. One day there's going to be Sanhedrin and they're going to understand. And maybe they'll understand that Korbanot, maybe they're relevant in a time where, it says, right? So the people aren't going to bring their Korbanot to the Avodah Zarah. So maybe it's only relevant if people are going to do Avodah Zarah. So maybe if they're not, I don't know, something like that. Like, I'm not saying that I can just wave it off like that. I'm just saying that is a possibility and a comforting thought for a person who is worried about the future. And at the same time, I think, for somebody that's learned the Gemaras and understand like this sort of like deep messages that are communicated through the Korbanot, I think they can be comforted by the fact that, part of Yom Mashiach is that the Bnei Yisrael are going to be educated. So if you learn about the Korbanot, like, I don't know, you learn Masechet Zvachim, you learn Masechet Midot, Masechet Tamid, and it just becomes, such this, just imagining the Avodah, it becomes a spiritual experience. So I would be comforted by saying, that I believe that at Tilavo, we're going to discover how these are resonant. And then there's not going to be protests. There's not going to be like animal rights protests. Nobody's going to view this as like a waste, because we're going to understand, how this is essential and important.
I've heard people try to teach like the Rambam, taught, not that he taught it, obviously he's explicitly saying that it's going to be reestablished, but that, in the time of of the third temple, there won't be any animal sacrifices, but only vegetation. Like they'll bring up Rav Kook and all that. The thing is, like you mentioned before, if you believe that nature will change, then obviously maybe people doesn't resonate anymore. But I actually think that the fact that people still do even Kapparot, whether you think it's correct or not correct to do it, the fact that people are still doing it today, and people are doing, sacrifices before the Torah was even, in existence, like this is a base human instinct that hasn't gone away, and the nature of people we haven't really changed. So there is something that
Right.
cathartic about the experience that I think people relate to. On the flip side of that, you have people will make the argument that, even in the time of Yeshayahu, once it became kind of like this rote, ritual where it's lacking any feeling and you're just doing it out of routine, then, it says Hashem detests those kind of
Yeah.
sacrifices. So
I mean,
like,
I think, I mean, there's a few angles, right? So, right. I mean, the Rambam points out that like Korbanot are almost like uniquely denigrated in the Nevi'im. It's like a mitzvah, and the Nevi'im are like, yeah, Hashem doesn't want that. Like, we don't see the Nevi'im saying, oh, Hashem doesn't want Shabbos or, I don't know, whatever, but basically, there's like different functions of the Korbanot. So in the Rambam's view, it's all sort of symbolic. And, one function is that, it seems in the ancient world, a lot of people had to drive to sacrifice and to pray to avodah zaras. And, it wasn't a nuclear Jewish thing. And if you told a person you can't bring a sacrifice to Hashem, then they would find a different God to sacrifice to. So you kind of had to have the Korbanot. And, but at the same time, I think that the Chachamim, like the people, the simpletons, that would actually be confused of whether to bring a Korban to Hashem or to Pluto or whatever, so that's how they're going to bring a Korbanot. They're going to bring a Korban. But Chazal don't like that. Like, that's not for the smart people, because Hashem doesn't take bribes. Hashem isn't like impressed with the sheep. And so, and it's like there's a combination of, oh, this is taking in the place of the avodah zarah, and we're like sort of monotheizing it. And then the other hand, we're going to take the opportunity, we're actually going to do the mitzvah in a way where there's a very deep lesson here. And so, actually, the Zohar talks about it as well. But basically, you could say for modern people are very out of touch with their mortality. There's this whole drive people should live forever. How do you really know what's going on inside your body? Like, we're not in touch with that. And the experience of taking an animal and saying, like, this is like me. I'm just like this animal. This is like my body is just as animal as this sheep's body. And, making that statement and then having it sacrifice is a statement that reminds us that our bodies are just animals. And you definitely don't want the animal side of you, driving your life. You want to sort of recognize that and use that as a motivation to, get your mind and your long-term vision and your purposefulness and your higher order thinking. That should be like driving. You don't want the animal driving. And then you bring this animal and you bring it on the Mizbeach, and this sort of symbolizes like, well, you have a body, and the body's wonderful because the body enables you to have, an effect on this world and do wonderful things. And that's sort of like bringing the animal on the Mizbeach is saying like, you can shecht, you shecht, the body, you take control of it. And we have it temporarily. We only have it for, maybe 100 years if we're lucky. And you want to use that for good while you can. And that's sort of what a Korban symbolizes. And, maybe that message is communicated most effectively through an actual physical animal sacrifice that, the three of us have never had the experience of doing. But it may be like maybe Dafka in the modern world, we're so out of touch with mortality. We're so out of touch with the true nature of our body, because so few people have actually seen the inside of a human body, that maybe this reminder could actually be super important and relevant.
I totally relate to what you're saying. Also because of the internet and social media, you're constantly just like, even on WhatsApp, you hear someone dies like every day, and it becomes kind of like you become detached. But as someone who I've done shechita, and when I've done it on, let's say, a chicken, like the pirkus, the first time at least that I did it, it's just like there's something, it did something to me because I felt that life energy kind of like leaving, and it was like it just it made you think. It makes a person think. And I definitely understand it now. I think maybe when I was younger, I didn't understand that. So there's something to what you're saying, and I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I also remember when after we learned Masechet Chulin in yeshiva, this was in Mitzvah. We there was a neighbor who had a sheep. He got a sheep, and we hired this Temani Shochet to come, and he like shechted the sheep, and he showed us all the stuff. So and that was I mean, besides being like super interesting to see, like he took out the matanot and he took out the gidanasha and everything like that, but it also it really it gives you this whole range of emotions. I mean, it gave me this whole range of emotions where at first you're shechting it and you're watching the sheep and it's like breathing and it's like bleeding out and you're like, you feel really bad for the sheep. You're just like, oh gosh, you feel bad for it. And I think in the ancient world, they also felt bad. I mean, these animals meant a lot to them. I think that I think they definitely they felt it. And and then as you're tearing it apart, I sort of wonder, like, oh my gosh, is that what I look like on the inside? And the answer is yes. For the most part, that's what people look like on the inside. It's kind of yucky, and we have all these things, and somehow that all works together to be a human body. And for me, it was really like the first time I really kind of embraced, like, oh, that's what I am. Like, I'm that thing. And I don't know, that's the truth of it. Make of it what you will. And I was even thinking at the time, like, oh my gosh, like this is what Korbanot are about. They tell you the truth of what we are, at least the body side.
Very well said. You explained it way better than I could have ever done. And I really thank you for both of us. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming since the first time you messaged us you emailed us. I think we hope to do this again, and I think our audience gained a lot tonight. If you can tell everyone where they could find you, how they can reach you.
So my email is I have an email, xvikaizen@gmail.com. That's an email. Let me think. Well, I'm also on LinkedIn. Anybody can reach out on LinkedIn. Just Zvi Goldstein. And yeah, I don't really have
your book.
That's my
your book.
Yes, and my book. So quick plug for the book. Maybe the listeners are wondering, what is this book? So basically, there's a book that I put together. It's called Summary of the Guide for the Perplexed. I wrote it under the pen name XVI Kaizen, so don't be too shocked. And what it is, it's a very short book. It's about 50 pages, and the main part of it is like 10 pages. The idea of the book is to take the Moreh Nevuchim, which is a wonderful book, and make it more accessible for the practitioner. So it's not for academics per se. It doesn't really go into the history, and the idea is that if you want to take out and focus and learn what are the main ideas that you're going to see in the Moreh Nevuchim, you're not going to see in other books that are relevant to Jewish practice, faith, belief, understanding in 2024. So that's what this book is focused on. And
it's kind of like a Cliff's Notes. in a way.
Yeah, Cliff's Notes. And the idea is that you could use this as a companion. You could go through it, and there's all the sources, so you could go through it and say, okay, well, what are the ideas that I like? What are the ideas that I don't like? And then look it up in the Mornevuchim and see how the Rambam discusses it. And then there's also some addendum, miscellaneous addendum in the end, like a sort of a brief commentary on Hilchot Deod, in light of the Mornevuchim and comparison with the Zohar, and sort of discussions of things that a lot of people get wrong, so like the understanding of the Eitz Hadas, and that's like one of these classic things where some people understand it one way and some people understand it the other way, and like Len Goodman's in my camp. He was on your podcast and he's like, I don't know. There's some people that understand it the other way. And like, I don't know where how they do this, so I'm in his camp and, so I put forth the argument there. And I don't make any money. I try not to make any money off of it. I sell it for the lowest price Amazon will let me, which is pretty much cost of printing plus I think like 5 cents.
Yeah, I noticed it's like $4, right? What is it?
Yeah, and there's no copyright on it because Torah is supposed to be hefker, and so that's basically what the book is. Like, sort of, my hope is that as many people could read it as possible, and ideally that can foster their own thinking about how to interpret the Rambam and how to sort of think about Yiddishkeit, and that's the point of the book.
Amazing.
Good stuff.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real honor, and thank you for putting together this podcast. I think it's like really important for for Yiddishkeit and the future of Yiddishkeit. I think these sort of podcasts are just like a phenomenal way, for people to kind of learn in a way that was just not possible before. And so, thanks a lot for putting it together.
We appreciate that so much. Hatzlacha rabah.
Yeah, you too.
Okay.
And Shavot Tov.
Shavot Tov.
All right.